Hello and welcome back to Forensic Bites and our series on evidence collection in forensic science. Today we're going to talk about anti-contamination strategies for the crime scene. What we're going to cover is some forensic strategies to minimise the risk of contamination across crime scenes during evidence collection. What an anti-contamination strategy might look like for a major crime scene or even across an entire case that can involve multiple different linked scenes together. In doing so, we're going to go into what's included in a good anti-contamination strategy, as well as some strategies for detecting whether or not contamination has occurred during evidence processing. First and foremost, your forensic strategy needs to be a good fit for the investigation or the case that you're working, and it also needs to be flexible enough that you can adapt it should the situation evolve. Planning will commence as soon as the particulars of a certain case are known, and it needs to be communicated early to all personnel that are going to be working at that crime scene. In terms of adaptability, the strategy needs to account for changes to the environmental factors, so things like the weather, the kinds of personnel and resources that you have available at your scene, and it needs to cover the entire lifetime of the scene, from the initial planning stage and setting up the cordon, to doing the evidence collection, to finally handing over or releasing the scene at the end of the investigation. So the major source for today's content comes from the Forensic Science Regulator Guidance, and this mainly relates to contamination in crime scenes involving DNA. And this reference covers all the information that we're going to be talking about today. Beginning with pre-scene establishment, crimes never actually get committed in a pre-cordoned area. So this means that the first responders who come across the crime scene or are called there are going to arrive at an unsecured scene. One of the first tasks is to then document everyone who has made entry into the scene before it was secured. And by secured, it means generally putting up cordons and manning them to prevent unauthorised entry into the scene. So this could be people like paramedics, could be firefighters, it could be members of the public, dog walkers, anyone who was there before it was taken over by the police. So you need to know who they were, and you need to potentially know what did they do, what did they touch. This will all need to be accounted for later at the end of the investigation. One of the questions that will be asked is what PPE was worn by those people. So quite oftentimes firefighters, paramedics, they'll be wearing different types of gloves if they enter into a scene. The first responding officer will hopefully have the presence of mind to don gloves, but all of this will need to be noted down in the newly established scene log. Some other pre-scene considerations include what's the weather like. So if it's hot or humid conditions, this can actually increase the risk of contamination based on the people working in the scene sweating more. In terms of what staff to use, you'll obviously use the staff that you have available, but you'll try to avoid using staff who have been present at linked scenes. So scenes in the same case that are in different locations, if you can avoid having those people be present at different scenes, you eliminate a risk of cross-contamination between the two. Same goes for anyone who's potentially going to be doing lab analysis later on. You don't want them collecting evidence at your crime scene because it invites the doubt created by potential cross-contamination. Even things like the different vehicles that are used above. So if you have a suspect and you're transferring them to the police station, you would want to use a different police vehicle if you were transporting a victim and there was potentially going to be evidence crossover between the two. When you're bringing equipment in to use at the crime scene, you need to make sure that these have been decontaminated thoroughly, or you can just go disposable equipment if that's feasible. Cordons are a key anti-contamination measure, and they'll be established by the first attending scenes of crime officer. This perimeter is maintained by officers tasked with preventing entry other than via the one single entryway. A crime scene manager can dictate who will enter, and the less the better. So the fewer people you have in a crime scene, the less potential sources of contamination through their DNA, fingerprints, etc. exist. Using a common approach path, whereby people entering the crime scene will follow in the footsteps of one another, also lessens the opportunity for contamination. And finally, a scene of entry tent assists in coordination, and it also provides a place for donning PPE or giving briefings, giving a risk assessment, providing that information away from the crime scene within the cordon. Once you're inside the scene itself, the crime scene manager is going to dictate certain aspects of the investigation, like which areas are the highest priority to preserve. So if we're thinking about a building that has multiple rooms, it's a murder scene, there is probably one, maybe two rooms where the majority of the action took place. There's going to be a call made on whether stepping plates are needed. So again, that's another way to reduce contamination, say from footprints. Let's say it's another scene that has a lot of blood in it. You don't want to be standing in a pool of blood and then walk it into another cleaner area. In terms of the teams of people collecting evidence, can you segregate the scene into different areas and divide your team up so that they are not crossing between those different areas? So if it's a house with 4 rooms in it and you have a team of 4 people, maybe you can allocate one investigator to each room and try to prevent people from crossing over and potentially cross-contaminating those different areas. Maintaining a detailed log is important, including the names of the personnel attending, the dates and times of the examination, the PPE that it was worn when you entered into the scene or not worn, and the anti-contamination measures that are in effect. And these, again, are going to be dictated by the scene manager. Some general best practices when inside a crime scene: movement within the scene should be kept to a minimum. So we've already discussed the potential of walking a bloodstain on the floor into another area. You can stop this just by limiting the amount of travel you have around a crime scene. Verbal communication should be kept to a minimum. Obviously, you'll be wearing PPE, which includes a face mask. And the idea of the face mask is it's going to prevent aerosolized saliva and thus your DNA contaminating the scene. But the less you are speaking, the better. It just reduces that risk even further. Now, I've given an asterisk because obviously you do need to communicate with a crime scene. For instance, if you discover a hazard, you need to quickly convey that information to other members working in your area. Expanding on that point, mobile phones and radios should not be used in the scene. You can always leave the scene, make a phone call, and then come back in, but within the scene, you really shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. Seized items are to be packaged as soon as practicable, and you should bring the packaging materials to the item, not vice versa. So again, bloody stained knife. What you want to do is you want to take your pristine, clean packaging materials to the knife, package it there, and then remove the packaged item from the scene for processing. You would not pick up the bloody knife, walk the bloody knife to wherever the packaging materials are, because you could be dropping small blood droplets on the way. If it's an item maybe that's been exposed to gunshot residue, you're going to be shedding gunshot residue into areas that may not contain any. Lastly, you should ensure that the packaging is adequate to prevent damage to that item of evidence in transit. So, detecting contamination. The first thing to know is that incidents of cross-contamination will inevitably still occur despite best efforts. So what we need is a way of determining whether or not contamination has taken place. And a detailed scene log can highlight a probable person to a transfer event. So someone who has been known to be handling a certain item of evidence, if it was seen that they handled 2 items of evidence and there may have been contamination between the 2, it could potentially be linked to that person. Now, it's good practice to retain the PPE, your personal protective equipment, from the investigation, and that can allow further analysis that might further identify if an unwanted transfer event took place. So looking at the log, maybe there was one item of bloody evidence and the next item, which contained what may have been contamination from that item of evidence. If you look at the gloves that were used between the 2, you may find evidence of blood on that glove. Now, reference samples may have already been taken from people present at the crime scene and they'll be in the DNA database. But if they're not, it may be required to collect those reference samples to exclude personnel later, or even to identify cross-contamination. Because of that, entry to the scene should be granted only to those who are willing to consent to give up their DNA to allow for these comparative or exclusionary purposes. So to conclude, contamination is an ever-present risk in any crime scene, and all you can really do is try to minimise the risk of it. A well thought out anti-contamination strategy will grow out from the pre-scene considerations, so management of the scene, cordons, the equipment, the best practices. All of this comes together to give a fully fledged anti-contamination strategy. That strategy needs to be flexible though, so it can adapt as situations change. If contamination is suspected, good documentation can allow you to determine whether or not it's likely and how to potentially improve your protocols in future so that it doesn't happen again. That's all for today. Thanks for listening to Forensic Bites.